Hello. This will be a demonstration of Proposition 17 from Book 9 of Euclid's Elements, which says that if numbers be in a continued proportion and the extremes be prime to each other, then the last number is not to any other number, just as the first number is to the second. This is just an extension of the previous Proposition 9.26, so it'll be proved in a similar way. We're given four numbers A, B, C, and D, which are in a continued proportion, so that A is to B, just as B is to C, just as C is to D. Furthermore, we're also given that the extremes, which are A and D in this case, those two numbers are prime to each other, so A is prime to D. What we want to prove from this is that the last number D is not to any other number, just as the first number A is to the second number B. For if this is not the case, then there will be some number E, such that D is to E, just as A is to B. And because A is to B, just as D is to E, we know this from our first step, we can alternate this proportion by Proposition 7.13 and say also that A is to D, just as B is to E. But we know from our given that A and D are prime to each other. We also know from Proposition 7.21 that numbers which are prime to each other are the least in their ratio, so that A and D are the least numbers which have the same ratio as B and E, which means furthermore by Proposition 7.20, which says that the numbers which are the least in a given ratio measure any other numbers in that same ratio the same number of times, the antecedent, the consequent, so that because A and D are the least numbers in the same ratio as B and E, A measures B the same number of times that D measures E. We don't care about all of that though, we just care about the fact that A measures B at all. And the reason we care about this is because it means that A measures C. Here's how that works. A is to B just as B is to C. We know this from our given. And because A measures B, we know that B also has to measure C just by the definition of proportionality, which is definition 7.20, so that B measures C. But we also know that A measures B, so a property of numbers tells us that A measures C, right? We know that 3 measures 6, 6 measures 12, therefore 3 measures 12. It's as simple as that. So A measures C. And we can prove in a similar way that A also measures D. For we know that A is to B, just as C is to D, so that because A measures B, we know that from our third step, C also measures D, but A measures C, therefore A measures D. And because A measures D, it means that the two numbers A and D are not prime to each other, because they have the common measure A. A obviously measures itself, and we've just shown that A measures D, so A and D are not prime to each other. But this is contrary to our given, which states that A and D are prime to each other. So if the number E exists, what ends up happening is that A is both prime and not prime to the same number D, which is obviously absurd. And so we can conclude that there is no such number E, and that D is not to any number, just as A is to B, which is what we set out to prove, which means we're done with the proposition. Therefore, etc. Q, E, D. Example of what this proposition might look like: 8, 12, 18, and finally 27. This is a continued proportion. 8 is to 12, just as 12 is to 8, just as 18 is to 27. And we also know that 8 and 27 are prime to each other. There is no common measure between the two of them. So what this tells us is that, just like last time, there's no number x such that 8 is to 12, just as 27 is to x. There will be no number which satisfies this proportion. In essence, what this means is if you have a continued proportion where the extremes are prime to each other, you cannot continue that proportion any longer. That's all I've got to say about this one, so I'll end the video here and move on to Proposition 9.18.